that'll be at the end of the video. Consider that a preview right there. As of now, we're going to go ahead, get our book lined. There we are. I made a mark on my desk so that I can line up the book best for you guys in your viewing pleasure. Let's go ahead and open this bad boy up. We're back in the East for chapter 3. So let's go ahead and remove our bookmark. Chapter 3, East. Dawn cracked like a heron's egg over Seiki. Pale light prowled into the room. The shutters had been opened for the first time in 8 days. Tane gazed at the ceiling with raw eyes. She had been restless all night, hot and cold by turns. She would never wake in this room again. Choosing day had come, the day she had awaited since she was a child, and risked, like a fool, when she decided to break seclusion. By asking Susa to hide the outsider in Arisma, she had also risked both their lives. Her stomach turned like a watermill. She scooped up her uniform and wash bag, past the sleeping Ashari, and stole out of the room. The south house stood in the foothills of the Bear's Jaw, the mountain range that loomed over Cape Pison. Along with the other 3 houses of learning, it was used to train apprentices for the High Sea Guard. Tane had lived in its halls since she was 3. Going outside was like stepping into a kiln. The heat varnished her skin and made her hair feel thicker. Seiki had a scent to it, the perfume of the hardwood and the trees, unlocked by rain, and the green on every leaf. Usually, Tane found it calming, but nothing would comfort her today. The hot springs steamed in the morning haze. Tane shed her sleep robe, stepped into the nearest pool, and scrubbed herself with a handful of bran. In the shade of the plum trees, she dressed in her uniform and combed her long hair to one side of her neck, so the blue dragon could be seen on her tunic. By the time she made her way indoors, there was movement in the rooms. She took a small breakfast of tea and broth. A few apprentices wished her luck as they passed. When the time came, she was the first to leave. Outside, the servants waited with horses. In unison, they bowed. As Tane mounted her steed, Ishari rushed from the house, looking flustered, and climbed into her saddle. Tane watched her, a sudden thickness in her throat. She and Ishari had shared a room for 6 years. After the ceremony, they might never see each other again. They rode to the gate that separated the houses of learning from the rest of Cape Pison, over the bridge that passed the stream that ran down from the mountains, joining the apprentices from elsewhere in the district. Tane caught sight of Tarosa, her rival, snaring at her from his line. She kept hold of his gaze until he kicked his horse and set off at a gallop towards the city, shadowed by his friends. Tane looked over her shoulder one last time, taking in the lush green hills and silhouettes of large trees against the pale blue sky. Then she stitched her gaze to the horizon. It was a slow procession through Cape Pison. Many citizens had woken early to see the apprentices ride to the temple. They threw salt flowers onto the streets and filled every pathway, craning for a glimpse of those who might soon be God-chosen. Tane tried to concentrate on the warmth of the horse, the clop of its hooves, anything to stop her thinking of the outsider. Susa had agreed to take the English man to Orisma. Of course she had. She would do anything for Tane, just as Tane would do anything for her. As it happened, Sousa had once had a liaison with one of the sentinels at the trading post, who was keen to win her back. With the landing gate unlocked, Sousa had planned to swim to it with the outsider and delivered him to Arisma's master surgeon with the empty promise of silver if he cooperated. The man apparently had gambling debts. If the trespasser did have the red sickness, it would be trapped in Arisma. Once the ceremony was over, Sousa would anonymously report him to the governor of Cape San. The surgeon would be whipped raw when they found the man in his home, but Tane doubted he would be killed. That would risk the alliance with the Free State of Mentendon. If torture loosened his tongue, the trespasser might tell the authorities about the 2 women who had intervened on the night of his arrival, but he would have little time to plead his case. He would be put to the sword to contain any risk of the red sickness. The thought made Tane look at her hands, where the rash would appear first. She had not touched his skin, but going anywhere near him had been a terrible risk, a moment of true madness. If Sousa had caught the red sickness, she would never forgive herself. Sousa had risked everything to make sure today was as Tane had always dreamed. Her friends had not questioned her scruples or her sanity, just agreed that she would help. The gates of the Grand Temple of the Cape were open for the first time in a decade. They were flanked by 2 colossal statues of dragons, mouths open in eternal roars. 40 horses trotted between them. Once made of wood, the temple had been burned to the ground during the Great Sorrow and later rebuilt with stone. Hundreds of blue glass lanterns dripped from its eaves, exuding cold light. They looked like fishing floats. Tane dismounted and walked beside Ashari towards the driftwood gateway. Tarosa fell into line with them. "May the great Quiriki smile on you today, Tane," he said. "What a shame it would be if an apprentice of your standing were to be sent to Feather Island." "That would be a respectable life," Tane said as she handed her horse to an ostler. "No doubt you will tell yourself that when you live it. Perhaps you will too, Honorable Tarosa." The corner of his mouth twitched before he strode ahead to rejoin his friends from the North House. Apologies for my verbal dyslexia. "He should speak to you with more respect," Ishari murmured. Dumu says you score better than him in most combat." Tane said nothing. Her arms prickled. She was the best in her house, but so was Tarosa in his. A fountain carved into the image of the great Quiriki, the first dragon ever to take a human rider, stood in the outer courtyard of the temple. Salt water poured from his mouth. Tane washed her hands in it and placed a drop on her lips. It tasted clean. "Tane," Ishari said, "I hope all goes as you desire." "I hope the same for you." They all desired the same outcome. "You were the last to leave the house." "I woke late." Ishari performed her own ablutions. "I thought I heard the screens in our room opening last night. It unsettled me. I could not sleep again for some time. Did you leave the room at all?" "No. Perhaps it was our learned teacher." "Yes, perhaps." They proceeded to the vast inner courtyard, where the sun brightened the rooftops. A man with a long mustache stood atop the step with a helm under his arm. His face was tanned and weathered, clad in armored sleeves and gauntlets, a lightweight cuirass over a coat of darkest blue, and a high-collared surcoat of black velvet and gold-brocaded silk. He was clearly both a person of high rank and a soldier. For a moment, Tane forgot her dread. She was a child again, dreaming of dragons. This man was the honored Sea General of Seiki, head of Clan Medici, the dynasty of dragon riders, a dynasty united not by blood, but by purpose. Tane meant to have that name. Upon reaching the steps, the apprentices formed 2 lines, knelt, and pressed their foreheads to the ground. Tane could hear Shari breathing. Nobody rose. Nobody moved. Scale rasped against stone. Every sinew in her body seemed to tighten. She looked up. There were 8 of them. Years she had spent praying before statues of dragons, studying them and observing them from a distance, but she had never seen them this close. Their size was breathtaking. Most were Sekinese, with silvery hides and lithe, whip-like forms. Impossibly long bodies held up their splendid heads, and they each had 4 muscular legs, ending in feet with 3 claws. Long barbels swirled from their faces and trailed like lines of kites. The majority were quite young, perhaps 400 years old, but several carried scars from the great sorrow. They were all covered with scales and ringed with sucker marks, keepsakes from their quarrels with the great squid. 2 of them possessed a 4th toe. These were dragons from the Empire of 12 Lakes. One of them, a male, had wings. Most dragons were wingless and flew by means of an organ on their heads, which scholars named the crown. The few that did grow wings did so only after at least 2,000 years of life. The winged dragon was the largest. If Tane had stretched to her full height, she might not have even been able to reach between his snout and his eyes. Though his wings looked fragile as spider silk, they were strong enough to whip up a typhoon. Tane spied the pouch beneath his chin. Like oysters, dragons could make pearls, 1 in a lifetime. It never left the pouch. The dragon beside the male, also lacustrine, was close to his stature. Her scales were a pale, clouded green, like milk jade, her mane the golden brown of river weed. "Welcome," said the sea general said. His voice rang out like the call of a war conch. "Rise," he said, and they obeyed. "You are here today to be sworn to one of 2 lives, that of the High Sea Guard, defending Seiki from sickness and invasion, or a life of learning and prayer on Feather Island. Of the Sea Guardians, 12 of you will have the honor of becoming dragon riders." Only 12. Usually there were more. "As you will know," said the Sea General, "there have been no hatchlings of dragon eggs for the past 2 centuries. Several dragons have also been taken by the fleet of the Tiger Eye, which continues its repulsive trade in dragon flesh under the tyranny of the so-called Golden Empress." Heads bowed. "To bolster our ranks, we are honored to receive these 2 great warriors from the Empire of the 12 Lakes. I trust this will herald a closer friendship with our allies to the north." The Sea General inclined his head to the 2 lacustrine dragons. They would not be quite as accustomed to the sea as Sekinese dragons, since they preferred to live in rivers and other bodies of fresh water. But dragons from both countries had fought side by side in the Great Sorrow, and they had ancestors in common. Tane sensed Rosa looking at her. If he became a rider, he would say his dragon was the greatest of them all. "Today you will learn your destinies." The Sea General took a scroll from his surcoat and unraveled it. "Let us begin." Tane braced herself. The first apprentice to be called forward was raised to the noble ranks of the High Sea Guard. The Sea General handed her a tunic the color of a summer sky. When she took it, a black Sekinese dragon huffed smoke, making her startle. The dragon wheezed. The Musa of the West House also became a sea guardian. The granddaughter of 2 riders, she was of southern descent, as well as Sakanese. Tane watched her accept her new uniform, bow to the sea general, and take her place on his right side. The next apprentice became the first to join the ranks of the scholars. His silk was deep red of mulberry, and his shoulders trembled as he bowed. Tane sensed tension in the other apprentices, sudden as a rip current. DeRosa went to the High Sea Guard, of course. It seemed like a lifetime before she heard her own name. The Honorable Tane of the South House. Tane stepped forward. The dragons watched her. It was said they could see the deepest secrets of a soul, for human beings were made of water, and all water was theirs. What if they could see what she had done? She concentrated on the placement of her feet. When she stood before the sea general, he looked at her for what seemed like years. It took all her strength to remain standing. At last, he reached for a blue uniform. Tane breathed out. Tears of relief pricked her eyes. "For your aptitude and dedication," he said, "you are raised to the noble ranks of the High Sea Guard and must swear to practice the way of the dragon until you draw your final breath." He leaned closer. "Your teachers speak very highly of you. It will be a privilege to have you in my guard." She bowed low. "You honor me, great lord." The sea general smiled. Tane joined the 4 apprentices on his right side in a stupor of bliss, blood rushing like water over pebbles. As the next candidate stepped forward, DeRosa whispered against her ear, "So you and I will face each other in the water trials." His breath smelled of milk. "Good. It will be a pleasure to fight against a warrior of your skill, Honorable DeRosa," Tane said calmly. "I see through your mask, village chafe. I see what's in your heart. It's the same as mine. Ambition." He paused as one of the men was sent to join the other side. "The difference is what I am and what you are." Tane glanced at him. "You stand on equal ground with whatever I am, Honorable DeRosa." His laughter made her neck prickle. "The Honorable Ashari of the South House," the sea general called. Ashari made her slow way up the steps. When she reached him, the sea general handed her a roll of red silk. "For your aptitude and dedication," he said, "you are raised to the noble ranks of the scholars, and must swear to devote yourself to the furtherance of knowledge until you draw your final breath." Though she flinched at the words, Ashari took the parcel of cloth and bowed. "Thank you, great lord," she murmured. Tane watched her go to the left. Ashari must be distraught. Still, she might yet do well on Feather Island, and she could eventually return to Seiki as a master teacher. "Pity," DeRosa said. "Wasn't she your friend?" Tane bit her tongue. The principal apprentice from the East House joined their ranks next. Onwin was short and burly, her sun-browned face sprayed with the freckles. Thick hair fell onto her shoulders, stripped dry by salt water and brittle at the ends. Shell blood darkened her lips. "Tane," she said, taking the place beside her. "Congratulations." "And to you, Onwin." They were the only apprentices who rose without fail each dawn to swim, and a kind of friendship had risen from that foundation. Tane had no doubt that Onwin had also hearkened to the rumors and stolen out to immerse herself once more before the ceremony. The thought unsettled Tane. Cape Bison was scalloped with small coves, but fate made her choose the one the outsider had arrived in. Onwin looked down at her blue silk. Like Tane, she was from an impoverished home. "They are marvelous," she whispered, nodding at the dragons. "I take it you hope to be one of the 12. "Aren't you too small to ride a dragon, little Onrun?" DeRosa drawled. "You might be able to perch on one's tail, I suppose." Onrun looked over his shoulder at him. I thought I heard you talking. Have we met?" When he opened his mouth, she said, "Don't tell me. You're plainly a fool, and I have no interest in befriending fools." Tane hid her smile behind her hair. For once, DeRosa closed his mouth. When the last apprentice had accepted his uniform, the two groups turned to face the sea general. Ishari, whose cheeks were tear-stained, did not look up from the cloth in her arms. "You are children no longer. Your paths are before you." The sea general glanced to his right. 4 of the sea guardians had performed above expectation. DeRosa of the North House, Onrun of the East House, Tane of the South House, and Amusa of the West House. Turn to face our elders, so they might know your names and faces. They did. Tane stepped forward with the others and pressed her forehead to the floor again. "Rise," one of the dragons said. The voice made the ground quake. It was so deep, so low, that Tane hardly understood it at first. The 4 of them obeyed and straightened their backs. The largest Sakanese dragon lowered his head till he was at eye level with them. A long tongue lashed out from between his teeth. With a great push of his legs, he suddenly took flight. The apprentices all flew themselves to the ground, leaving only the sea general standing. He let out a booming laugh. The milky green Lacustrine dragon displayed her teeth in a grin. Tane found herself locked in those wild eddies of eyes. The dragon rose with the rest of her kin over the rooftops of the city. Water made of flesh. As a mist of divine rain streamed from their scales, soaking the humans below, a Sakanese male reared up, gathered his breath, and expelled it in a mighty gust of wind. Every bell in the temple rang out in answer. Niclays woke with a dry mouth and a fearsome headache, as he had 1,000 times before. He blinked and rubbed a knuckle in the corner of his eye. Bells. That was what had woken him. He had been on this island for years, but had never heard a single bell. Niclays grasped his cane and stood, his arm trembling with the effort. It must be the alarm, an alarm. They were coming for Sawyer, coming to arrest them both. Niclays turned on the spot, desperate. His only chance was to pretend the man had hidden in his house without his knowledge. He peered past the screen. Sawyer was sound asleep, facing the wall. Well, at least he would die in peace. The sun was sweating too much light. Close to the little house where Niclays lived, his assistant, Must, was sitting under the plum tree with his Sakanese companion, Panaya. "Must," Niclays shouted. "What in the world is that sound?" Must just waved. Cursing, Niclays jammed on his sandals and picked his way toward Must and Panaya, trying to ignore the sense that he was walking to his doom. "Good day to you, Honorable Panaya," he said in Sakanese, bowing. "Learned Niclays." The corners of her eyes crinkled. She wore a light robe, white flowers on blue, the sleeves and collar embroidered in silver. "Did the bells wake you?" "Yes. May I ask what they mean?" "They are ringing for choosing day," she said. "The eldest apprentices at the House of Learning have completed their studies, and have been placed into the ranks of the scholars or the High Sea Guard." Nothing to do with intruders, then. Niclays took out his handkerchief and mopped his face. "Are you well, Roos?" Must asked, shading his eyes. "You know how I loathe the summer here. Niclays stuffed the handkerchief back into his jerkin. Choosing day takes place once a year, does it not? He said to Benaiah. I have never once heard bells. Not bells, but he heard the drums, the inebriating sounds of joy and revelry. Ah, Benaiah said, her smile growing, but this is a very special choosing day. It is. Do you not know, Ruse? West chuckled. You must have been here longer than I have. This is not something Niclays would have been told, Benaiah said gently. You see, Niclays, it was agreed after the great sorrow that every 15 years a number of Sakis, dragons, would take human riders, so that we might always be prepared to fight together once again. Those who were chosen for the High Sea Guard this morning have been given this chance, and will now endure the water trials to decide which of them will be dragon riders. I see, Niclays said, interested enough to forget his terror about Sawyer for a moment. And then they fly their steeds off to fight pirates and smugglers, I presume? Not steeds, Niclays. Dragons are not horses. Apologies, honorable lady. A poor choice of word. Benaiah nodded. Her hand strayed to the pendant around her neck, carved into the shape of a dragon. Such a thing would be destroyed in Virtuedom, where there was no longer any distinction between the ancient dragons of the East and the younger, fire-breathing worms that had once terrorized the world. Both were deemed malevolent. The door to the East had been closed for so long that misunderstanding about his customs had flourished. Niclays had believed it before he had arrived in Arisma. He had been half convinced on the eve of his departure from Mentendon that he was being exiled to a land where people were in the thrall to creatures just as wicked as the Nameless One. How frightened he had been that day. All Mentish children knew the story of the Nameless One from the moment they could fathom language. His own dear mother had relished scaring him to tears with her description of the father and overking of all fire-breathing creatures. He who had emerged from the dread mount bent on chaos and destruction, only to be grievously wounded by Sir Gallian Berethnet before he could subjugate humankind. 1,000 years later, the spectre of him still lived in all nightmares. Just then, hooves thundered across the bridge into Arisma, jolting Niclays from his musings. Soldiers. His bowels turned to water. They were coming for him, and now the moment was at hand. He found himself light-headed rather than afraid. If today was the day, so be it. It was either this, or death at the hands of the sentinels for his gambling debts. Saint, he prayed, let me not piss myself at the end. The soldiers wore green tunics beneath their coats. Leading them, of course, was the chief officer. Handsome, ever so good-natured chief officer, who refused to tell anyone in Arisma his name. He was a foot taller than Niclays, and always wore full armor. The chief officer dismounted and strode towards the house where Niclays lived. He was surrounded by his sentinels, and one hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Rose! A gauntlet-covered fist rapped on the door. Rose, open up this door, or I will break it down. There is no need to break anything, honored chief officer, Must called. The learned Dr. Ruse is here. The chief officer turned on his heel. His dark eyes flashed, and he walked towards them. Ruse! Niclays liked to pretend that nobody had ever addressed him with such contempt, but that would be a lie. You are very welcome to call me Niclays, honored chief officer, he said with all the false cheer he could muster. We've known each other for long and— Be quiet, the chief officer snapped. Niclays shut his mouth. My sentinels found the door to the landing gate open last night. A pirate ship was seen nearby. If any of you are hiding trespassers or smuggled goods, speak now, and the dragon may show mercy. Benaiah and Must said nothing. Niclays, meanwhile, did brief and violent battle with himself. There was nowhere for Sawyer to hide. Was it better to declare what he had done? Before he could decide, the chief officer motioned to his sentinels. Search the house, says. Niclays held his breath. There was a certain bird in Sagi with a call like a babe, beginning to wail. To Niclays it had become a torturous symbol of his life in Arisma, the whimper that had never quite turned into a scream, the wait for a blow that never came. As the sentinels rummaged through his house, that wretched bird took up its cry, and it was all Niclays could hear. When they returned, the sentinels were empty-handed. "Nobody there?" one of them called. It was all Niclays could do to stop himself sinking to his knees. The chief officer looked at him for a long time, his face a mask, before he marched to the next street, and the bird kept calling. "Hick, hick, hick." Slow it down. I'm going to move my mic just a